The Ebola outbreak in West Africa continues to grow, and the numbers are expected to get worse. The World Health Organization is out with new estimates today, warning the number of Ebola cases could hit 21,000 in 6 weeks unless countries ramp up their efforts to fight the virus.
This is exponential increase, with hundreds going into thousands of cases per week. And if we don't stop the epidemic very soon, this is going to turn from a disaster into a catastrophe.
Nearly 6,000 people have contracted Ebola since the outbreak first surfaced 6 months ago. Since then, at least 2,800 people have died from it.
The Ebola disease does indeed involve economics. There is also money to be made from Wall Street that has nothing to do with putting down a penny on any company nor seeking out what is the investment of the moment. It has to do with what being some might call a snitch. But in the world of high dollars we deal in here, it's better called informant. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced money, and on Monday, a payment of between $30 and $35 million to an unnamed person who handed over information the feds used to find an ongoing fraud. Indeed, there's money to be made in watching what goes on right under one's nose. Welcome to MidPoint, Chairman of the Society to Advance Financial Education, Steve Beaman. Steve, always a pleasure to see you.
Well, Ed, it's a pleasure to be back on, as always. I enjoy your program.
Thank you very much. We enjoy the insight as well, because maybe we might even save a couple of bucks along the way. Let's look at making a couple of bucks. This was just astounding, certainly not unexpected, because the SEC now has the ability to go ahead and award whistleblowers. This is a payment between $30 and $35 million, basically blowing the whistle on an ownership group here. What does this tell us then about how the SEC is attacking these people, and what does this tell us about the roles of whistleblowers?
Well, this is all part of the Dodd-Frank legislation, and what they're offering is a between 1% and 10% payout of the total amount fined by the SEC for people turning in fraud. And I think most of us, in fact, especially those of us in the financial services industry, welcome enforcement of fraud laws. None of us want the industry tarnished by people who are dishonest or doing the wrong thing. But there are unintended consequences to this. And what you're now going to have is an increased let's call it spotlight put on all these small businesses that are affected by this kind of fear. And you'll just see higher minimums put on investors, because the cost of managing investor assets will go up in direct relationship to the fear that advisors have that they'll be turned in by somebody for something they might have done.
What does this tell us now about actual investigations? Because you and I both know that if somebody sees $30 to $35 million, they're going to be looking for even the slightest, the smallest transgression that may not actually be anything wrong. This seems like it could flood the SEC with allegations.
Well, we're always into those unintended consequences, and I do agree with you. I think you're going to not only have a flood of investigatory things going on, but more than that, you're going to create a bit of paranoia in the financial services industry. So they're going to be less willing to hire new people. They'll be less willing to bring on new people. So I'm not sure turning, if you will, Americans against Americans is the best way to go about rooting out fraud. Again, none of us support people who do fraudulent activities, but the best way to go about it may just be old-fashioned investigation work, not necessarily creating a you versus them mentality.
What will this also do on the positive side? Because may this not then indeed, though, get a lot of companies to straighten up and fly right and be a little bit more than scared about what somebody might say?
Well, clearly it will do that. I mean, when you've got the ability of an individual within an investment firm to turn that firm in, whether it's a minor infraction or a major infraction, it will certainly highlight, if you will, the regulatory supervision that goes on within those businesses. So for the big companies, it's not really that big a deal. They've got the money and the resources. My concern is for the small advisors, where they don't have the money to pay for all the regulatory controls.
All right, money of another kind. Here is Ban Ki-moon, the United Nations Secretary General, making a statement about the global warming conference and the effort to try and at least slow it down. Listen up.
The actions that we take today can open the door to greater opportunity, prosperity, and dignity for every person on this planet. That is why we must increase political momentum towards a meaningful universal climate agreement in Paris in 2015. If we cannot swim together, we all will sink. And there is no plan B, because we do not have planet B. This is my line always, and I count on your leadership and strong commitment.
Steve, we don't have Planet B, but we certainly better have Plan B when it comes to spending here, because climate change will not come cheap.
No, and I think most of us would agree that we want sustainable energy. We want clean energy, and business is actively participating in trying to create solar power that works, wind power that works. The problem you get into, of course, is the regulations that are imposed by global bodies like the United Nations in this really do affect people. And when you look in the coal industry in the United States, those folks have been affected by this. And we really don't know in the short term whether the use of coal is doing this. I think there is still some question. Now, granted, again, I don't want to become a denier, but I do think we have to look at the cost of controlling these things until we can find alternative sources that are productive and worthwhile.
I got a little bit over a minute left, so let's talk about what the break began with here, and that is Ebola. We need to also consider the economics here because, as you pointed out and others, Africa is a huge part of the growth prospects in the next century, so this can have a domino effect around the world.
Well, there's clearly an issue here. If you look at Liberia, for example, last year they grew at about 8% as an overall economy, which is really terrific. This Ebola outbreak will cost them about half that growth this year. We're expecting more like 3.5% to 4% coming out of Liberia. And if you look at Guinea or Liberia or Sierra Leone, their tourist season starts in November. And you can bet the impact of this fear on people is going to cause their tourist industries to really hurt. So this is a major issue for these countries that are just now developing into the middle class economies we want to see.
And they also have a tremendous amount of debt, correct?
They do indeed. And again, that debt service can cripple these countries. It takes off their GDP growth and ultimately creates inflation as the governments try to deal with it. So this is a huge potential issue. I'm pleased that the global community is stepping up to help try to mitigate this a little bit. I think it does point out that we need to increase the resources that we can provide into these countries for medical care and things like that so that we can prevent this kind of tragedy from occurring.
And Steve, unfortunately, the one thing we always have to look forward to, or at least think about when we talk about a global community, is people making sure they do things in a timely manner and not dragging their feet, which could simply put us back centuries, and that's the unfortunate part of it.
That's exactly right. And whenever you deal with governments around the world, you're going to deal with that kind of time lag. So
Indeed.
We hope for the best, and we continue to pray for those folks in the Central African areas.
Absolutely. Steve Beaman, always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, next hour here on MidPoint, Republicans are once again fighting back on what they perceive as the phony war on women. And after the break, a nation thanks a college quarterback for reminding them of what is really important in life. Telling it like it is next.